Friends, I am very happy to continue our series on the origins of faith, and we are continuing with Dr. Yoav Ashkenazy, who has already become our dear friend, and we are already receiving a great deal of feedback from viewers for this series as well. צופים גם לסדרה הזאת. So we were with you the last time we were in Egypt, and now we have traveled north, having passed through the lands of Canaan and the land of Israel, and we find ourselves somewhere in the region of Turkey, Anatolia, Syria, and Lebanon, all of those areas. We are in regions where the major power, the dominant culture, is the Hittite culture. But the Hittite culture, of course, absorbed the surrounding cultures, and it is not for nothing that it is called the culture of 1,000 gods, because it absorbs so much. What should we discuss if we want to try and understand what the people who lived there believed in?
Well, first we should really clarify exactly what it is we're talking about. In Mersbi Ashkera, we're tracing how human beliefs evolved, specifically the nature of those enchanted worlds, examining the Paleolithic and hunter-gatherer era. We explored the transition phase, part hunter, part nomad, part settler. Finally, we looked at the rise of great empires in Sumer and Egypt. Empires whose star rose in the 4th and 3rd millennium BCE, and now we are moving on to the 2nd millennium. Why is this interesting to us? Overall, we see that the systems of relating to the gods haven't changed profoundly. We see that many concepts appear. We have already seen in Egypt types of monotheism. We've seen concepts where the divine is the cosmos. We've seen God as one and gods as his manifestations. We've seen Akhenaten's concept. The God is the sun itself. We saw Sumer and all the flood myths and the stories like Prometheus, right? The one who brings wisdom. We saw how these things eventually lead to the civilizations known as the Axial Age civilizations. The axial civilizations include Israel and Judah. Let's just consider them to be essentially the same entity. Greece, the Greeks, and the broader Greek culture, the Buddhist culture found in India, and the Confucian culture that developed in China. They all excel in a thought process it has some similarity. We'll get into that in a moment. We'll get into it when we talk about them to say what. But we're trying to understand how the old materials and old perceptions reach these groups. And here we have conduits, panels of the transmission of Amorite, Sumerian, Akkadian knowledge, and of the various cultures that were in that region. And these two large panels, one with the Mitanni kingdom, the kingdom of the Hurrians, we'll discuss them shortly. The second is the kingdom you presented, which is really an empire in the imperial sense, the Hittite Empire. A wandering Aramean was my father. My father was a wandering Aramean. What is an Aramean? He came from Urkesh. He came from the Hurrian region, the Hauran region, the region of ancient Kurdistan. In other words, my father was a wandering Aramean. He was likely Hurrian. Now he is a Hittite associate. Was he Hittite or Hurrian? We don't know. His culture called him Hittite, but he might be Semitic. He was genetically Hurrian originally. 4 out of 5 13th century skeletons in Israel had holes. And what does that say about our link? They passed down many traditions and ideas, and the second thing is, of course, the Hittites. Who are the Hittites? The Hittites control Troy or Wilusa. Today we believe that Troy is Wilusa, that the city that the Hittites are working very hard to control. They have peoples there who are causing them great trouble, and they are working hard to gain control of it. We see things among the Hittites that reach the Greeks, just as we see the Mesopotamian concept of the treaty reaching Israel and Judah through the Hurrians and the Hittites. It could also be through Assyrian mediation, since the Assyrians were taking over after all. The Neo-Assyrian Empire takes over everything later on. And we see ideas like, we see a mythological similarity between the Hittites and the Greeks. We also see sports among the Hittites. Take boxing matches. Many traits, like the organization and strict order, we later see in the ancient Greeks too. comparing these cultures, it's hard to tell them apart, especially when they first arrive in the region. I mean, to our world after the late Bronze Age collapse, after essentially the collapse of the 12th century and the formation of Israel and Judah. Let's say, I don't know, the 11th century, the 10th century, a century that isn't clear. I'm not getting into the debates at all. It's not interesting. Oh my. They lived the elite for generations intertwined with one another, and they shared beliefs, rituals, and technological forms. And perhaps the entire Hittite expertise in chariots actually came from the Hurrians. After all, the Hittites did add the wheel, moving it from the back to the middle. It could be that this is a Hurrian story altogether, because we know about the Hurrians before we know about the Hittites. We know of the Hittites from around the 18th or 19th century BCE. There is a group called the Hattians, but they are not the Hittites. They are a group that lived in the Anatolian regions before the Hittites arrived. We know this because the Hittites are Indo-European, while the Hattians are not. And there was likely some kind of merging there as well. The Hurrians were a Caucasian people. We hear of them by the 3rd or 4th millennium. By Sargon's time, they were intermingled with Akkadians and Sumerians. They absorbed the culture, but also contributed their own. For example, they would depict gods, guardians, but in the Hurrian style. They loved, their colors were black, red, and white, and they had very, very, very well-known patterns. Besides that, they were masters of the chariot, but that comes later. I mean, they were masters of metal. At certain periods, they had furnaces that reached 2,000 degrees Celsius, which is quite a feat. So tell me, who are the holes?
Indeed, in later periods, we can observe that the army of King Ahab, at least according to the inscription, possesses what is, in fact, truly one of the largest numbers of chariots among all the contemporary kings, a development which could very well represent a tradition and an influence that Hamas ultimately finds its origins in the region of Hauran.
Absolutely. Alongside the Egyptian influence you enjoy, as you often point out, and rightly so. Well, the thing about those holes is that we are already familiar with them. We said around the middle of the 3rd millennium, they live half like the Israelites, pastoral. In the summer, they roam with their herds and have permanent settlement in the winter. That is to say, they have another similarity to us, their language. They probably arrive from the Caucasus at some point. We don't know exactly when. We also don't know their language. Their language belongs to the Iroquois family. We have one other language like that. It died out very quickly. It's not related to anything. We know the Hurrians almost solely from the Hittites. Or when the Assyrians mentioned them, or the Egyptians, because at certain times there were very, very strong ties. Their influence in Akkad was likely very, very significant, and their names start appearing in Akkadian constantly from 1000, 2000, 2200. Between 2500 and 2000, their cities were super dominant in Mesopotamian politics. Urkesh of Abraham, our forefather probably. I don't know, there are debates. Kakemish and Kahat, which served as their most important religious center. What happens is that the Akkadians are replaced at some point by the Amorites, also a type of Semitic people, and a guy named Shamshi Adad establishes an empire. I think around the 18th century BCE, and when his empire ends with his death, he didn't manage to create. We are talking about unity. Essentially, the Hurrian people and their various city-states began to form strategic alliances, eventually evolving into a unified federation. Starting from around the 17th or perhaps the 16th century BCE, we can truly begin to speak of the formal establishment of the Mitanni state. But what exactly was Mitanni? The Hurrians, they hate. A primary and central authority that they can't stand it, and it seems that in these years a new arrival joins them and becomes their elite. I don't know how, we don't know. In an Indo-European group from the Zagros Mountains, suddenly you see they worship gods named Nanda, Indra, Shiva, Aruna. Now you also see Hurrian names that are Indo-European. What was the king's name? I don't remember. We'll get to that. Here's the second one. All kinds of names where you see the connections. What probably happened is that this became their elite. In other words, the people who knew how to master ironworking and chariots were likely the Indo-Europeans. That's a hypothesis. Everything is very speculative. But the descriptions of the chariots are a one-to-one match with the descriptions in Sanskrit. Some of them you can find in the Vedas, which are very, very ancient texts, 9th century, 8th century BCE. As far as religion goes, they are actually quite tolerant. It really doesn't bother them in the slightest. So, what are you? Who are you? You? First of all, there is syncretism. We have no problem with that. You worship the gods. They are also heavily influenced by the gods. That is to say, their gods are very influential. They accumulate a great deal of power. But around 1350, a succession crisis begins there. The brilliant king Suppiluliuma, who was not only a king but also a master diplomat, steps in and mediates between the conflicting parties. In other words, when they are already at odds, he continues to stir up conflict between them and the heirs. And in fact, he is also using this time for his own benefit. He conquers Aleppo and destroys the ancient kingdom of Yamhad, starting the long, arduous process of dismantling the empire's foundations, leaving it vulnerable to collapse. מתחיל להחליש ולפרק את האימפריה. The Assyrians in the north are also constantly chipping away at them, fighting them all the time, and there are constant waves of Hurrian refugees coming down and returning to Mitanni. That is to say, from the regions that Mitanni previously controlled, they are coming back, and this creates immense economic pressure. Now, in parallel, cultural identity is weakening as all the money goes to war. And this process in the 14th century creates a spiritual crisis that causes them to decline further and further. Around 1275, they destroy the capital. The institutions and the management institutions, and there's a mass exodus there, and that's actually probably Rami Ovid was my father. Yes, these are guys trickling down from these areas to the areas of Accra, Akran, and Canaan, and so on and so forth.
In the 13th century, they actually start moving back and forth. Perhaps that is also how they arrive in our region in large numbers.
Absolutely. And this is what Israel and genetic research in the century relies on, that we find them among us. Well, in terms of trade and culture, as I said, they started a semi-nomadic life. They raised livestock, but at first without large cities. They gradually built cities. They crafted unique ceramics traded across the region, plus the metalwork mentioned. Axes, daggers, plows, sickles. They ran massive trade and administrative networks. Each city had a connected group, an administrative body, taxing passage between Anatolia and Mesopotamia. They were also exceptionally strong in the production of textiles. Later, we see the arrival of chariots, and the art of driving was a closely guarded state secret. The training process lasted for 281 days. A surviving text describes this specialized horse and chariot training. The elite nobles, known as the Marianu, were the ones who participated. These Mariani are also an Indo-European name. That's also why Israel Knoll says it was probably an elite. I don't know enough to talk about that. You remember that we aren't speaking here as researchers. We are speaking here as people who have studied various research and are discussing it in a reasonable manner. There are different levels of discourse. Philosophical discourse is one thing, research-based discourse is another, and philosophical discourse is not research-based discourse. And that needs to be understood.
What we are interested in right now is not the history, but the development of religious rituals. That is our primary focus. However, it is impossible to do this without addressing the history. You really need to know who the key players were.
Absolutely. Let's get to religion and ritual. At the center, the heart of their settlement in Kahat, stood a massive ziggurat. The religion is Mesopotamian, but the style is Hurrian. The gods, the main god, Teshub, a storm god. Yes, Zeus, Baal, and what was later absorbed into the name, into Yahweh, and Hebat the sun. We know the servants of Hebat from Jerusalem. Yes. We notice the main storm. God brings both life and death, because lightning burns everything, but the rain brings life. In other words, there is this duality here. He is depicted as a man wearing a horned hat, standing on a bull. Oxen are the animals of this region. Move into Anatolia, it's a ram. You might see a connection to the binding of Isaac leading to the ram.
Within the ancient kingdom of Israel as well, we can observe that the estuary itself serves as a profoundly significant and central symbol for their culture.
Yes, yes. It's just that we're talking about way, way before. So I assume.
We are currently in the 13th or the 14th century, is that right?
Yes, I suppose the idea of the ram as a sacred animal comes from Anatolia, because many peoples there regard it as sacred. Also, we have Kumabi, god of harvest and grain, plus Dagan and Dagon, both associated with grain. Another deity shares this nature. Shaushka, goddess of love and healing, is also a war goddess. That is a fascinating aspect of Hurrian culture. Their connection to the underworld is also really interesting. They have tons of funeral rituals, communicating with the gods, the goddess, the gods of the underworld, and they have special gods in the underworld. Elani, Ugar, and Nergal also share these traits. They worshipped various Indo-European gods too. And their myths mirror those we've seen before. Stories start with gods fighting for cosmic control. Each time they violently dismember their father. Kumar castigates his father, just as Kronos castigates Uranus. I think that's the order. And he creates the cosmic order from the severed genitals. Yes, from the seed in the severed genitals, all the new gods are born. And but then after 9 years, Teshub arrives. It's 9 years, 9 years, 9 years. That's how it is among the gods. Teshub arrives and deposes him. Their holidays essentially carried over the entire Mesopotamian tradition to the worlds of Anatolia and our regions and its agricultural life. They also had a huge influence on the shaping of the Canaanite pantheon. Yes, Baal is definitely some kind of Teshub or something like that. Let me see here. And a great many Hurrian names appear in the Bible. They were officials, they were rulers, they were in the Levant for many years after the Mitanni ended, and they were known. Now, for example, they had this ritual where they dig 20 or 30 meters, make a circle in the wall, and then close it in some kind of square structure. Then the priest would go down and draw a circle, like a magic one, just like all those pagan nut jobs do today. You know what I mean? גנובים היום של הפגניזם, אתה יודע על מה אני מתכוון? A huge movement exists in Northern Europe, like including Latvia and Sweden. Many diverse people are involved. They would go there to commune with the gods of the underworld. The underworld is vital. Evidence shows they buried their dead beneath their homes, though not everywhere. Mind you, we're pulling from sources, projecting. It's irresponsible. Historians would shoot us before doing this. Read their research. They're so guarded, every sentence is a qualification. We have none. We're being historically irresponsible, but we must tell a story. It's the only way to discuss these topics. We have nothing else. We said the priests could go down there. Besides that, I reviewed some fascinating Hurrian rituals this morning. I need to find my notes. Truly fascinating stuff. First, the new moon. In Urfa, we know they light up for the new moon on the 1st of every month with festivals lasting a few days, mostly in winter. Oh, let's remember that in the winter they were settled, like even in the early periods. So obviously the festivals wouldn't be when they were on the move. Yeah, that makes much more sense. Now, right, we have the story of the scapegoat found in the Bible. The priest lays his hands on a male goat and sends it out into the wilderness. Okay, the Hittites have this too, but with all sorts of animals so that even the poor could afford it. You could even put it on a mouse. But this idea of placing your sins or the sins of your community or group onto someone else is a very interesting concept that we're familiar with. I don't know of it from anywhere else, but it's possible it exists elsewhere. The central ritual was, unsurprisingly for Alani, inside Ishtar's temple stood a shrine to Alani, goddess of the underworld. The priest would sacrifice a bird or sheep and fill a cup with wine for her, as well as for Hutena and Hutran. These underworld deities determine the fate of your soul. The Hurrians were deeply concerned with death and the afterlife. Within the sacred temples, they also anointed the gods with precious oil. we know of this ancient practice from the Hittites, and it eventually reached us as well. There were also purification rituals involving water. You had to wash the statue, but before that, you were strictly required to wash yourself first. First, the priest would act, and then the judge. There are some truly fascinating protocols, but we must remember that in all the villages, they continue to live in a Neolithic, Paleolithic way. In other words, we are in worlds where the community exists, not the individual. Actually, there's no real death. The rituals belong to small local gods. And they very, very much involve the entire community, whether through song or movement. There is preservation here. We spoke about preserved core processes, the forms of worship, the functions of the all worship. Those are the home, those are the field. The Hittites even had their own specific god for locks and doors. Honestly, it really feels like there was a god for absolutely everything in their world. That is the primary driving force behind it all. You are the one, you are the source of that energy. I mean, it is the, and quite basically, it is the villagers. They adopt the form, the imperial form, but they also continue to live out the frameworks of connection and relationship with nature that date back to the Paleolithic era, and this continued until the 19th century. It's not something that disappeared in the villages of Europe and things like that. They share, I mentioned that how in Europe they beat village boundaries to ward off demons, and there's so much more. Yes, you're Slavic, you know this better than I do. My Czech friends know countless rural rituals like that. Okay, you're from St. Petersburg, you're nobility, I'm not messing with you. No, not a peasant. Sorry, I apologize. I know I'll make amends for that later, that I said that I dared to say something like that about someone from St. Petersburg. Especially now that you've been in control of Russia since Putin has been in power. Anyway, Putin, yes. Do you know that the Siloviki come from St. Petersburg? The inner circle of, I'm saying Putin and I, yes, we're also part of the Siloviki. What does that mean? Were you part of it too? Everyone was at the Dacha. You're a bit too young to have been at their Dacha in the 60s or 70s, but okay. Basically, the 70s and 80s. So these are the Haredi guys, and they have super interesting institutions. They hate centralization. They are always either for the camp or for Israel. Yes, everyone goes their own way. Everyone returns to their own group. They have interesting family traditions. The Brotherhood institution, for example, when the family has a problem or a dispute, all the brothers sit together in a room, discuss it, and resolve. Solve. I have no doubt that such things have persisted to this day and still happen. Israel links them to the Kurds, and I have Kurdish friends who describe it that way. For example, if a mother passes away. So that's exactly what we're doing. All the brothers come and ask up, what are we doing now? You will find there is always one individual or one who stands out as being more dominant, and they are all something very, very interesting. And in general, the Horesh are an absolutely exceptional group of people within this entire area. And if we move on now to our friends, the Hittites, who, as we said, likely influenced the Greeks. So when we talk about the Hittites, we're talking about Anatolia. It starts in the center east of it, and not in the western regions, certainly. But listen, we are all familiar with a group of people known as the Hittites. These Hittites have been established there since the 3rd millennium. That is to say, roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era. And honestly, we don't know all that much about them. We know the Hittites from the 18th century because we have a text called the Anita text, which is the oldest text we have, and it dates back to about the 18th century. Their first king was probably called Labna or Lubna. I don't know exactly how they pronounced it. And their capital was called Hattusa. He conquered the lands around Hattusa, laying the Hittite kingdom's foundations. Yet Hattusili truly established the kingdom around the 16th century. He personally led their many battles as the endless conflicts between Hittites and Hurrians raged on. There was they just seem to drag on and on endlessly without any sign of ever stopping. And what makes it even worse is that the Hittites are a culture that simply does not believe in the concept of peace. For them, war is the normal, everyday state of their affairs. Popeda, it's just reflected elsewhere, though not from the same era. And take the Odyssey and Iliad. It's similar. Now, Homer claims to describe the 12th or 13th century, but describes the 9th or so, it seems. But of course, there were connections between these behaviors. So they don't tolerate it. They have no interest in peace. They are basically fighting all the time. And that is why the empire of Hattusili, not the first one, doesn't succeed, because they are constantly rebelling. The one who does, the one who establishes things, is a king named Telipinu. But he's likely a relative of his, and he's trying to organize things and set up inheritance laws, and he's making some very, very impressive arrangements and institutions. By the way, the Mitanni also had super impressive institutions, super impressive laws, and super interesting ways of solving problems. Not only Telipinu tries to implement all these various measures, but the Hittite pile simply couldn't care less. Honestly, the whole thing just doesn't hold up. In the end, he fails to stop the wars. Well, actually, the Hittite Empire was in turmoil for about 100 years, between 1550 and 1400. All the succession wars, their influence waning, their expansion halted. They were in deep trouble in 1424. Anslianus, does the name Anslianus sound like anything to you? The very first one of these is the one that actually establishes the foundations of the new Hittite kingdom. This is the period when they conquer what is known as Troy. They fight fierce battles in Hapala, Mira, and Wilusa. These places are inhabited by peoples who fight against them, and they are also constantly encroaching on Mitanni, which is steadily weakening. From 1400 to 1180, they are truly a great empire. This is their time. They are simultaneously expanding deep into Syria, and their institutions are growing stronger. In 1344, Suppiluliuma rises to power, crushing the Hittites until he dies of a plague. Finally, in 1274, they clash with Ramses II at the legendary Battle of Kadesh. Demonia's monumental clash involving Ramses eventually concluded with Egypt finally choosing to accept the Hittites as their equals, which is truly an extraordinary turn of events. You must understand that the ancient Egyptians were deeply xenophobic people, often referring to these foreign outsiders as nothing more than vile Typhonian monsters. On the price, there's recognition between, they know each other. A peace agreement was signed, and a son was even almost sent there to marry someone, Nefertiti, I think. We don't know exactly, but he gets killed. He's murdered on the way, and it doesn't happen. אבל הורגים אותו, רוצחים אותו בדרך, וזה לא קורה. Around 1180, they are finally wiped out. The combination of the Assyrians and the Sea peoples that tear the whole region apart, right? Peoples who in the 12th century, due to endless climatic and other catastrophes, leave their lands, band together, set sail, and just like a swarm of locusts, raid everywhere. And except for Egypt, they completely tear apart all the old empires. It seems the folks from Crete, meaning the Mycenaeans, are part of these sea peoples. They have a major influence on the Greeks, and eventually the Hittites retreat to Anatolia and Cyprus, which they had already conquered. But Assyria, in the end, takes it, and their numbers dwindle. And there's a terrible flood there that traps them within the climate catastrophes, and a famine ensues, and the entire vassal system collapses. And from about 1180, we start hearing only about individual cities. I
just want to point out that in the Bible we see Uriah the Hittite, for example, during the time of King David. The Neo-Hittites, yes, those are the Neo-Hittite kingdoms that emerged after the end of the Bronze Age. These are not the same kingdom you were just talking about.
No, and we also said they could be genetically and culturally completely different. Actually, I mean, we don't have the answer. It's a mix, and we don't really understand what happened there. The Hittites were subtle. They fought often, but once they conquered, they left things be. They kept local elites in power, like the Hurrians. They didn't. משאירים את האליטה המקומית וגם החורים. קצת ככה. That is not really the case. It is not like the Assyrians coming in and boom, imposing their whole war machine. They impose their system and they do not care about anything else. And what is interesting is that they also had certain women's rights. Women actually had specific inheritance rights. We know that from the Bible, right? I suppose I do not. Do you know of any other source besides the Hittites and the daughters of Zelophehad in the Bible that discusses women's inheritance rights? I'm not sure. They are also quite lenient when it comes to the treatment of slaves. If you happen to be a Hittite woman who marries a wealthy slave, then you remain a free person and your children remain free as well. Which really they basically open the door to, after all, what are slaves? When you look at it, slaves are just them. At some point, they're running Rome. They're much more successful than the locals at a certain point, and they're also involved in managing things. So do you want to open like Joseph? Let's say you could think of a story like that. Do you truly wish to open your society to such blood and such dark thoughts? A society that chooses to close itself off will surely die. Right? That's really the whole problem today with cultural appropriation. If you believe in cultural appropriation, then Yoav can't learn anything from Alex through imitation, and Alex can't from Yoav either. Like, it means this is actually a way to segregate cultures, to lock them within themselves. And you know what happens to cultures that close themselves off? It signals the end. Well, regarding their social order, trade, culture, and religion, they maintained a structure with a king at the head, who served as the representative of the gods and high priest. And upon his eventual passing, he was sometimes even elevated to the status of a god. Canada, they had a Hazan or Hazano in their language, which was the chief bureaucrat. The mayor was essentially responsible for water, drainage, and fire safety, since everything was made of wood. A fire safety officer. You know what the folks in Game of Thrones didn't have? When she goes into the temple and sets it on fire, what's her name? The one who rides the dragons. They didn't have a fire safety officer at the temple, and look what happened to them because of it. But the Hittites did. Besides that, there were two called Dehsin.
Khaleesi, I think that's in a movie, right?
Yeah, I hear you, Khaleesi. If there had really been a professional fire marshal on duty in charge of all the fire safety protocols, she wouldn't have been able to go and burn the whole place down like that. So that is the entire scene for you.
That is right. They are really quite pluralistic in that way.
Super hyper. These things don't bother them at all. They are very, very, very open to the gods of other people. But there is a bureaucratic mechanism in control. Hittite law is very lenient. There is almost no death penalty just for rape. I mean, they take sexual crimes very, very seriously, and that aligns well with the idea that women have a relatively high status there, although sexual crimes are also against men. It's not a world where that's the case. And we mentioned that women also ran businesses and inns, and they worked in all walks of life. In Yengen, anyone could complain about a bureaucrat to their superior, which is quite interesting. Oversight and such. And we mentioned that slaves could marry freely. The Hittite rituals are truly fascinating to behold. They cherished the act of communicating with their many gods. They were devoted to prayer, and they constantly made humble requests of them. We have a lot of texts like these, really beautiful, delicate texts. They were also the thousands of chariots and horses, obviously, and they are actually, we know the concept of the biblical covenant from them. It could be it came from Mesopotamia, it could be it came from elsewhere, it could be, but we know it from them. Aside from that, well, I'm just not sure.
They enter into many solemn covenants and swear by all of their gods. It is quite similar to the sacred covenant between God and the people of Israel in the Bible. That is absolutely correct.
Absolutely.
It is very much the same thing.
Exactly. I'm just not going into detail because I want to cover a lot of ground. We want a broad overview, but whenever you need to elaborate, jump in. There are things I don't remember either. I don't know. It's very important. A lot of purification rituals. Purification by water, purification by blood. We know of blood rites from the Hittites. Perhaps it came from elsewhere as well, but we know it from the Hittites. You have a purification ritual where the priest pours pure river water over the text and says, I cleanse the city of evil and nourish the abundance of the gods. Are there any other formulas? The priest sacrifices a white goat and offers its blood to the gods and says, King, in your name we call for peace, blessing, and fertility. I don't think the word is peace. I think they translated it wrong. It's probably prosperity or peace doesn't fit them. They're really not into that sort of thing. Also, if you happen to feel sick, they will draw your blood. They are able to draw your blood. Even in the temple, they sprinkled blood on walls to purify, right? In Israel, it was part of healing rituals. So the struggle, as we said, is with impurity, essentially forces of chaos. What happened to those forces? Back in Sumer and Egypt, they did not truly die. They are still here with us. They are here with us right now. We are constantly needing to catch up with them. Human culture, you must remember, is always, it is deeply related to the passage of time and the inherent openness of time as well. You know, it is constantly struggling to push back the forces of chaos, which are now transforming into the dark forces of absolute impurity. In the Bible, there is impurity, except for the Sabbath. We cannot speak in the Bible about a primordial chaos that is greater than God and continues to accompany us. So the concept of impurity in the Bible remains floating because it is not clear where the impurity comes from. There's only one God, right? Why would there be, where would this impurity come from? From his son? And then you see later theologians that say, yes, he has a bad side and a good side and a feminine and masculine side. But all these things are because they severed the connection between primordial chaos and impurity. You see, this connection is from the moment there is one God, it is severed, and we don't even know why impurity surrounds everything all the time. I mean, that's the feeling with the priests and also with the early Tanaim. I mean, also with the Pharisees and the Tanaim, the feeling is that you are constantly pushing out impurity. And the Hittites, I mean, we said that if we go back to the Hittites, they created the chariots with the wheel in the middle, we said, and they were very, very strong, and they also trained horses for many months, like the Hurrians. And as you said, they created the concept of the biblical covenant. They also used to wear earrings and various other accessories like that. They adopted, just as you said, the gods and deities of many, many different peoples.
Mythology too, we see creation stories there that are by and large similar to what we know from Mesopotamia, only in...
Absolutely. The central myth, even among them, by the way, is that a storm god like Zeus, Baal, or Teshup is at the center. The myth is, once again, as we said, the gods are created from the severed sexual organ of the god, right? The Hurrian myth, the truth is, we're probably not entirely sure. There is a group of gods under the main gods, but those are more or less the gods of the central gods of the Hurrians. Teshup, Hebat, Inara, the daughter of Teshup. They have a smith god, Hasamili, who reminds us of Hephaestus, the smith god who appears in the story of Troy. I don't know, maybe it's Inanna, maybe it's Elena, but it doesn't fit Inanna. She's in charge of the birth. There are Istusia and Papia who are in charge of the underworld, and they are counterparts to the Hurrian couple we mentioned earlier, the gods of the underworld. And there were also, as we said, household gods, gods of technology, gods of the oven, gods of the lock. There was a god of the door. There were all kinds of gods. They had these huge feasts in their rituals with a lot of super interesting things. They used to make a sandwich with blood, with liver. I mean, bread and liver. We have and the blood of the liver, or just the liver. We actually have instructions on how to make it. And as for them, naturally, of course, whatever was slaughtered was then prepared into a stew for the priest to consume. They were, we said, feeding the sacrificial blood for purification. And at their big festivals, there was plenty of food, entertainment, music, dancing, and sports. There was boxing, weightlifting, and also, get this, a cheese war. What is a cheese war? Nobody knows. Maybe it was a cheese ball. I don't know. Maybe they threw cheese at each other. I have no idea. We don't know what went on there. Their language, as we said, was an Indo-European language, and prayer was very, very central. They were constantly making offerings to the gods, turning to them, talking to them, and building relationships with them. Now, these two distinct groups, these two specific groups, stand, as we previously mentioned, within the conduit. Indeed, they serve as the primary conduits that emerge from the total collapse of the era, arriving, as it were, through the catastrophic late Bronze Age collapse into both Israel and Greece. Maybe you could say a few words about the late Bronze Age collapse, Mel, since you know much more about it than I do.
Look, what we know is mainly from the texts and the pollen studies conducted by both Tel Aviv University and others. and the Hittites send something in the end when they are in a state of famine, right? A long and difficult series of truly terrible years followed in their wake. The Egyptians managed to survive, as they were fortunate enough to have access to both water and food. They even attempted to provide assistance to the Hittites, who sent desperate requests that are still preserved in the time Amarna archive. It is simply
nerds, I'd say, and that doesn't do them any favors.
They're crying out for help, and we know the Egyptians were likely sending them ships loaded with wheat. Of course, in the end, nothing helps, and that whole world collapses. But yeah, it must have been a truly tragic and traumatic event. We see it in Ugarit as well. And there's something else I want to add. The mythology in all those regions is fascinating. She's always talking about some god who created the world, like our god in the Ugaritic pantheon, the creator god, that holy couple. Yes, like the creator of the heavens, and there's always some active, combative god who you could say challenges the father and replaces him. Abba Machlifuto. We see this again in the Ugaritic stories, and it's quite detailed. There, the daughter even challenges the old god, who has essentially retired and is off somewhere. And we see in the texts, the Ugaritic ones, for example, how Anat arrives and he flees from her, hiding behind hundreds of rooms. That's how it's described. I mean, it exists, and I mentioned this regarding Ugarit because that's where those texts come from, but it also exists among the Hittites. The idea of challenging the god who created the earth is very interesting. In my opinion, it symbolizes some, I would say, people. This young god is in truth much closer to humanity. Indeed, he is far more integrated into our society, if one could even put it that way.
You can see the progress being made. Yes,
he is active, he is more active, he exists here, and there is some kind of force of the creator, the earth, and they are actually telling him,
just as Kronos is time. But when you move down from him, it's already Uranus. That's already something weaker, meaning there is progression.
It seems humanity, in partnership with this deity, is assuming a greater level of authority. It is a recurring concept I find quite fascinating. This theme is present in all these cultures and clearly seen among the Hittites. Once again, another point I'd like to make is that just like the Egyptians, they have a tolerance for different creation stories, and we easily have about 3 Hittite stories that tell of creation in different versions, and they have no problem with that either. In other words, their picture, the picture of the truth is not like what we say today. What does that mean? Either Yoav's version of the story is true or Alex's version is true. There is simply nothing else.
When you're with them, you tend to say that the more the merrier.
Yes, and if not, we will go to war, and whoever wins, their story becomes the only true one. And we see that for them, it really didn't matter. I mean, there is this story, there is that story, and they are perfectly fine living with it. This helps explain the nature of our ancient texts, which often present us with conflicting versions. These were smoothed over and harmonized to fit a strictly monotheistic framework. But for the people living there at the time, including the ancient Israelites, and it didn't bother them in the slightest that stories existed side by side. So honestly, what is the problem? There is absolutely no problem with that. They didn't see it as a problem, and I think that's very hard for us to understand today because our minds already work in a monotheistic way with some kind of absolute truth that must be a certain way, and that of course is also what Christianity and later Islam took to an ultimate level. Yes, where Christianity said either you believe and you are saved, or you don't believe and your fate is death. And
yes, but first and foremost, I think the monotheistic narrative is above all his story. It's God's story, and you share the same ethics, and both of you must uphold them. That is the essential story. That is why monotheism is required. If you could maintain that with other gods, but I don't know how compelling it would be. To me, that's the whole point. This God, who is a personality like you, and therefore he does have a standard of holiness. Be holy, for I am holy. What am I? Let me tell you, I perform all these rituals, and in truth, God himself performs the rituals within these perceptions. And yes, he shows Moses, and I also show all these moral qualities that must exist within you. That is to say, the whole idea. What is that?
No, that's a great point. I'd like us to elaborate a bit more on what you said. A few sentences about the actual continuity of these beliefs. I really see a connection between the prehistoric world and the historical world, right up to the late Bronze Age collapse. where we see all these basic beliefs. Yes, for example, blood has probably played an important role for 10, 20,000 years already, because as you once explained, people understand that life is connected to blood.
Blood and breath.
Yes, blood is the soul.
No, and breath. It appears in our Genesis. It's an amazing story in Genesis. It's true that it doesn't speak of creation ex nihilo. That's probably in the beginning God created. In the kakuam. But we have many concepts where God creates himself automatically. The chaos is not. But we have all the elements of the ancient world there. God is also present in the blood, and therefore shedding blood is forbidden. And you see here the connection again between ethics and, well, yes, suddenly there is an ethics of blood. That's it. Spilling that is a very, very serious matter. You are strictly forbidden from spilling the blood of humans or animals. Perhaps you are allowed a very small group from the majority.
But we also see kosher laws that originate from the Bible. They talk about blood in food, and you cannot eat blood. Even today, with kosher meat, we remove the blood. And what then?
That is absolutely correct. Yet it is also the exact opposite. God breathes the very essence of life into man. Ancient, deep-seated, animistic concepts exist here, but a new modern world is layered over them, placing humanity and our complex social world at the center, alongside a sense of universal ethics. But regarding all these things about Israel and Greece, we'll talk about Israel. I hope we'll talk about it in the next meeting. I don't know how many meetings we'll need for Israel and Greece. I hope we can do each one in a single meeting. Yeah? But what interests me is the late Bronze Age collapse. Are the Phoenicians part of it?
Yes, absolutely.
Like with the sea peoples?
You could say that. Look, you have to say
we don't know what
this phenomenon exists in every inhabited part of the world we know. For example, if you go to Sardinia, you'll see an entire culture there, the Nuragic culture, that is being abandoned. People are leaving everything behind, even a magnificent culture of which there isn't much left. There are no texts from which you can understand exactly what they did, but we have no doubt that there is.
But for the Mycenaean language, we have records. For the Mycenaean culture, we have the script known as linear B.
Yes, and we can truly observe people departing, simply vanishing, and entire cultures slowly disappearing. Yes, even in our modern day, you can still witness these ancient sites that were abandoned, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing remaining there. This all occurs during that very same historical period, and this phenomenon is incredibly widespread, and what follows is that we truly witness the rise of entirely new nations. Yes, while it is true that we obviously always focus on Israel, we must also consider the broader context of the entire region, taking, for example, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms that were springing up everywhere, and subsequently, all we see are the relentless wars waged by Assyria against these kingdoms. The Battle of Karkar is really just one part of what occurred after the Bronze Age collapse. Yes, and this also includes the region of Canaan, the greater Canaanite lands like Moab, Ammon, Israel, and Judah. Yes, all these kingdoms, where do they come from? From the Bronze Age collapse. What did that lead to? It led to the fall of empires, the fall of, I would even say, the fall of the civilization of that era.
It holds true for the benefit of city-states and small regional kingdoms.
Consider the strategic retreat of the once mighty Egyptian empire. At that point, their primary objective was simply to hold on to whatever territory they still had left. They were compelled to safeguard their fertile lands against relentless invaders who coveted their abundant food supplies and sought to plunder them. Consequently, they found themselves with no choice but to hunker down and mount a firm defense of their borders.
I am beginning to get the impression that we have finally reached the end of all of this. Don't you think that is the case?
Yes, and next time, what topic will we discuss? How do you suggest we continue?
I suggest we start with everyone's favorite topic, the one we're going to get the most heat for, ancient Israel.
Ancient Israel? Okay. Yes, by the way, there are also some conversations I had about the Mitanni and the Hurrians with Professor Noy. Yes, it's worth checking out. We also have a lot of influences.
He really knows so much more than I do, you guys.
Yes, I also had a conversation about impurity. Yes, where we also talk about these influences, some of which probably really come from the Khorasan wheat. Again, it's the same cultural set. Yes, when they say wheat, and yes, Khorasan is the same cultural.
Yes.
cultural, social set, that it's all mixed up there. Yes, it's not something defined. Yes, just like us.
This is the second millennium in the region of Kurdistan, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. There were other peoples there alongside the Assyrians who lived there for a long time. In other words, these are essentially the same worlds.
Right, I understand. Dr. Yoav Ashkenazy, I would like to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so very much for that, Alex.
We're already looking forward to the next episode. Guys, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, spread the word, and support Alex. Thanks. This channel exists for two reasons. There are many viewers who watch this channel, and there are people who have decided to lend Alex a hand and become patrons of the channel to support this work. Click the link below the video. Help me continue. Amaman, tako.